Reprise du débat, the honourable member for Lakeland.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. It's become clear the Liberals are using the pandemic to shut down accountability and transparency, and potentially to usher in big government dependency while targeted support isn't actually getting to Canadians who desperately need it. Right. And over 5 years and now, no province has borne the brunt of the Liberals' divisive, anti-business, anti-energy, anti-resource policies more than Alberta. The Liberals outright campaigned against Albertans and oil and gas in 2019, and now this government is using COVID-19 to finish what they started, the destruction of Canadian oil and gas. What's crazy is the finance minister and the natural resources minister actually even keep acknowledging how bad it is for Canadian oil and gas right now, that the OPEC cartel has dropped prices, disproportionately harming Canadian energy while demand has declined due to the pandemic, with no plan to go forward for Canadian energy and the programs they've promised to help are complete failures. So Albertans can be forgiven for concluding that the lack of support is by design, that it's intentional. After 85 days after the finance minister promised help in, quote, hours or days, the specific help for small and medium-sized oil and gas companies never actually happened, and it just got merged into a generic mid-sized loan program. But to qualify, a medium-sized company needs $100 million in annual revenue. I guess Liberals have a different definition of what a medium-sized business is than the rest of us, or are completely oblivious to the damage that's happened in the sector so far. And even if a company does qualify, the interest rate is higher than the banks. The large employer program has interest rates that rise to 15% by year 5. That's payday loan rates. That's not emergency assistance. And the small business loan amounts are too small for oil and gas suppliers, while drillers face 1 or 2 years of zero revenue, so short-term and fixed loans are really of no use. And the $1.7 billion for orphan wells, well, it's a drop in the bucket, meant to create 5,000 jobs for a sector that has lost more than 200,000 since 2015 and 20,000 since the pandemic started, with no end in sight. But orphan wells have increased 300% since 2015, precisely because of Liberal policies that have bankrupted operators. And the Liberals, they put the big banks in charge of applying for most of the BDC and EDC COVID programs, but banks are refusing because of the risk-sharing provisions or to avoid doing work for a program from which they won't profit. And the reality is, Liberal ministers have been told all of this directly, repeatedly, privately, and publicly, so their lack of action seems intentional and malicious. These Liberals are either oblivious or don't care about the damage they are doing to the fabric of our country, giving billions of Canadian tax dollars to their elite cronies and their entitled, connected buddies, or benefiting Liberal friends and families while everyday Canadians are struggling. On a personal note, let me say it's incredibly sad that as the federal representative, often the first thing my constituents say to me these days is that it's time for Alberta to leave Canada. It's not just a vocal minority, it's a growing view in Lakeland, and I believe it's my duty to express the scale and scope of that frustration and anger. People aren't just talking about the concept, they're talking about the mechanics, which should be particularly troubling given the unprecedented health, fiscal, and economic crisis that Alberta faces now. It doesn't make the news, I guess, because we're from a rural area or we're from the prairies, easy to ignore in Ottawa, but these Liberals have so destroyed many Albertans' faith in the federal government to the extent that they have given up on the idea of Canada. That should shake every person in this chamber, everyone listening. It didn't happen overnight. It accumulated after 5 years of targeted attacks on Lakeland and on Alberta, on federal jobs in my riding, on the oil and gas sector, on rural communities, on farmers and farm families. Cutting so many Albertans out of COVID-19 emergency supports is only the latest example. From day one, the Liberals have gone out of their way to destroy livelihoods in Lakeland and in Alberta, ignoring hundreds of thousands of job losses, spikes in bankruptcies, suicides, and family breakdowns, sacrificing families and their children's futures for ideology and for partisan gain. There's a serious agricultural emergency in Lakeland. After early snow-trapped crops in the field last fall, this year spring harvest was followed by excessive rains that flooded fields, prevented seeding or drowned crops, wiping out farm incomes for a third straight year. Liberal-caused uncertainty in export markets and the pandemic make things even more complicated for all producers. And to make matters worse, the Liberals, they hiked their carbon tax by 50% on April 1st, right in the middle of the pandemic, increasing costs for farmers farmers who do manage to get their crops off the field and making literally everything more expensive in every sector of agriculture. But of course, no industry has endured the single-minded sabotage and vilification of this Liberal government like oil and gas. The Prime Minister tells the world he wants to phase out Canada's most valuable export and largest private sector investor in the economy. The Liberals blocked, delayed and cancelled infrastructure for Canadian oil and gas, not for the benefit of the planet, because Canadian oil and gas is the most socially and environmentally responsible in the world, but in order to burnish the Prime Minister's celebrity status in the global jet-setting United Nations crowd. It makes no sense. Developing all of Canada's resources and exporting Canadian natural gas will do far more to address global environmental challenges than anything the Liberals have imposed on Canada, and in particular on the prairies. After the 2019 election, Liberal campaigners admitted they vilified the oil and gas sector. They put their electoral gain ahead of the country. Clearly, the Prime Minister has learned from his father's campaign tactics. As Pierre Trudeau's strategist said when justifying the pillaging of Alberta's earnings, "Screw the West, we'll take the rest." Liberal cabinet ministers and Liberal MPs actively campaign against opportunities for Albertans that would benefit all of Canada, like the Tech Frontier project, and they've supported funding pipeline protesters and petitioned against oil and gas projects that would benefit Alberta and all of Canada. It's created an inherent animosity that goes beyond even changing this Prime Minister and this government. The Liberals and the establishment's ambivalence to the thousands of mom-and-pop oil and gas suppliers shutting down in Western Canada in real time, the lack of long-term assistance measures, the domino effect, or financial support for producers to get drilling started again has been heard loud and clear in Lakeland, make no mistake. For the first time since 1965, Alberta will receive more money than the federal government from the federal government in 2020 than it sends. For 55 continuous years, wealth generated by Alberta strengthened the rest of Canada. The NEP in the 80s under Pierre Trudeau took the most, over $30 billion a year. With its end, that declined, but since 2005, Alberta contributed more than $20 billion a year than it receives, more than any other province. Structural changes are needed to make Canada work for Alberta, to level the playing field. That would be good for all of Canada, to value all of the regions in our country. But these Liberals are using COVID-19 as a so-called opportunity to re-engineer Canada's economy in ways that will further alienate and impoverish the West, and they're supported by their allies on the left. Alberta punches above its weight in Canada. It's not an accident of geography or natural resources or demographics. It's not a coincidence. It's because generations of Albertans and Albertans by choice created an advantage, combining hard work, innovation, personal responsibility, and free market principles and policies to create private sector opportunities and a growing economy that attracted the best and the brightest and the youngest from all across Canada and the world to work and raise their families. It's because of free markets and free enterprise policies that propelled Alberta's economy to create 9 out of every 10 new full-time jobs in Canada as recently as 2014, and to be a net contributor to Canada continuously for more than half a century. But the worst damage has always been done by federal intrusions into Alberta's natural resources policies, such as the NEP, now the dismantling of oil and gas through bills like C-69, like C-48, blocking pipelines, other regulations and roadblocks, barriers to exploration, to drilling, the carbon tax, and now the failure of COVID support programs. And other provinces and regions, they have similar natural resource assets and opportunities, but they've not taken the same approach. It was because of the private sector and Alberta's entrepreneurial, risk-taking innovation, combined with positive federal and provincial fiscal policies, that unlocked remarkable opportunities in Alberta for all of Canada. After the 2015 election, in my first words in the House of Commons, I said, "A strong Alberta means a strong Canada." It's really a tragedy for my riding and for our country that the Liberals have done everything they can to undermine that reality. On election night, the Prime Minister said he heard Alberta and that he would do better. He has not. My constituents are watching everything they built for generations collapse in front of them, and the federal government keeps asking them to sacrifice more. Except one more review, one more regulation, one more tax. It's suffocating Lakeland, and because of Alberta's outside contribution to Canada, it will suffocate Canada's economic recovery. The perspective that Canada doesn't work for Alberta is unfortunately pervasive in Lakeland. As elected representatives, we owe a duty more than platitudes about our positions on industries and laws and taxes, more than politics for personal and partisan gain. This is obvious to freedom-loving Albertans and Albertans by choice. In Lakeland, it's a self-evident truth that the status quo is not acceptable nor sustainable. And I hope if anything I've said in the chamber today makes colleagues angry or uncomfortable, I hope it weighs on them. I hope it keeps them up at night like it does me. And I hope they stop enabling and helping the most corrupt and entitled and out of touch Prime Minister doing all this damage to our country.
Ends in comments. The honourable member for Regina North.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the member's comments, even though I respect what it is that she, as a member of Parliament, can express whatever she wants to inside the House and attribute it to her constituents. And it is somewhat upsetting when I, as someone that grew up in the prairies, I have been in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Alberta. That's where I spent my military days, was in Alberta. And I think that there are very strong nationalists, Mr. Speaker, that truly value and appreciate the contributions of being in a country with 10 provinces and 3 territories and so forth. This member, probably more than most, will stand up and, the story of a wolf in a sheep's clothing, to try to give an impression, a false impression, that the government of Canada does not care about the province of Alberta is absolute false. It's a bunch of garbage, Mr. Speaker. That is the reality of it. This government has given more money, more resources than Harper ever gave the province of Alberta and indeed the prairies, Madam Speaker. You can speak the myths, truths all you want, but it does not change the facts, Mr. Speaker. And at the end of the day, I see myself as a nationalist that's very proud to be coming from the prairies. And I stand up for the prairies all of the time, Mr. Speaker. And I take exception to a member that tries to give the impression that Alberta is not being taken care of from the government of Ottawa. When I was in the military, posted in Edmonton, I was very critical of the provincial government for not divesting Alberta's economy. There's all sorts of reasons as to why it is Alberta is being challenged to the degree it is being challenged today. And would the member not agree that it's not just Ottawa, it's Alberta, it's municipalities, the different stakeholders, all of us have an important role to play. And that includes the fine work that I believe that the federal government has done in investing in Alberta as it has in the prairies. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Lakeland.
Well, I guess that captures the irreconcilable difference that we may reach. I would invite that member to come to Lakeland and try that baloney on any one of my constituents.
100%.
And the point I'm trying to make is that the sentiment I outlined in my remarks crosses demographics, crosses ages, it crosses partisan lines. This concept of the country not working and needing to A, get a better deal for Alberta, or B, explore other options, is being talked about in my very rural and very conservative, it's true, riding in Lakeland, by people who voted NDP in the last 2 provincial elections, by people who voted Liberal in the 2015 election. They've come up to me and told me that. And I would suggest that the response from a Liberal minister and a senior cabinet or a senior member and a person who's been here for a long time to stand up and yell at me and berate me and suggest that what I've said is invalid and not true is just actually exactly the problem. Now, I need to make one thing clear, and I'm a first-generation Albertan, actually. My mother was from Newfoundland, my father was from Nova Scotia, and just so he understands that personal context. But his comment about this government giving more money to Albertans than other government or ever before, or whatever it is, just like when they promised they were going to be the most transparent and accountable government in the history of the universe, right? That's a fundamental misunderstanding of what people in my riding want out of the country. and a fundamental misunderstanding of the way they hope that government operates. Albertans in Lakeland, and I'll only speak on behalf of those, but I suspect some of my colleagues from the province would say the same thing, just want to be able to do their work, just want to be able to live their lives, just want to be able to contribute to Canada. But it is this federal government, through successive policies and laws and tax hikes and global messages and domestic messages, that have blocked oil and gas development in Alberta and caused this alienation and frustration. And no amount of peacocking and yelling and screaming and shouting me down and berating me will change that fact. They better get this message and get it quick, because it is these Liberals and it's their anti-energy, anti-Alberta, anti-West leftist allies who are putting the country at risk. They need to look themselves in the mirror for the sentiment that I am speaking on behalf of the people who sent me here to do this job.
Questions and comments? We have the honourable member for Courtenay Alberni, who's joining us virtually.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my honourable colleague for her passion for her constituents and for her province. Mr. Speaker, I was talking to the CEO of the Indigenous Tourism Association of Canada yesterday, who we all know do great work, and he does great work on behalf of Indigenous businesses in this country. They were just recently informed that they will be getting a contract for $16 million to deliver to over 600 Indigenous businesses, which is much needed, as we know. But they were also told that they're not allowed to use any of the funds for administration or to help deliver the program. In fact, that they were told they were going to be audited. But we learned also, as we know, that the WE organization was going to get a $43 million fund for administrating their program. And of course, the chief of staff of the Prime Minister, his company is getting $84 million as a commission to administering this program. Does the member agree that there's two ways that this government does business? One with their friends, and then one with those that aren't well connected. And also, does she agree that there's systemic racism that exists in this country, and we can see it right now at a time when organizations need support to deliver the much needed support to the people in our country, like Indigenous tourism business operators that need help right now?
The honourable member for Lakeland.
I'd like to thank my colleague for that question. I absolutely agree. I think this Prime Minister and the Cabinet and every Liberal member who enables and accepts scandal after scandal, ethics investigation after ethics investigation, literally things that have never happened in the history of our country before, covers for them, reads off their notes, does the dirty work for the Kings. I think that they absolutely demonstrate, like the member has said over and over and over, that there is one standard for the Liberals. There's some benefits only for the Liberals. There are one rules for the Liberals. There's only certain things the Liberals can take advantage of, and then there's, the reality for everyone else. I also want to thank him and acknowledge him for raising this issue of Indigenous businesses, because in Lakeland, in my riding, some of the businesses and communities that are hurt disproportionately and the most because of the destructive anti-energy policies and programs of the last 5 years and the failure of the current COVID-19 programs are First Nations and Métis communities. Among the barrage of report after report after report of businesses collapsing at an exponentially increasing rate over the last several months, one situation was that a First Nations-owned energy-producing country and community stopped producing for the first time in their history in my riding in Lakeland. And so when I'm talking about the failure of COVID-19 programs to support oil and gas businesses, I'm also talking about a failure of COVID-19 programs to support Indigenous businesses and workers. For the first time, this community now has to figure out a way to cover their costs when they used to cover all of their programs and all of their services within their community by their own source revenue from their energy company. Now they face a completely uncertain future and an utter fiscal crisis.
Questions and comments? We have time for a very short question and hopefully a very short answer. The honourable member for Edmonton Manning.
congratulate my colleague from Lakeland for such a heartfelt speech. And the question, since we don't have time, I don't think the debate is over who's federalist, who's not federalist, who's nationalist, who's not nationalist. The sentiment in Alberta, we all feel it. We're all members of Alberta in this House, and we know how much of a sentiment, a strong sentiment against the government. Now, what adds fuel to the fire now is the scandals that this government is going through. If the member of Lakeland will be able to tell us how much that is contributing to the position of Albertans when it comes to this government.
Member for Lakeland in 30 seconds or less,
Yeah,
please.
huge. I mean, it's exactly part of the problem. Albertans can't understand why this government blocks or roadblocks or harms them, yet has billions of their very own tax dollars that they generated to hand out, you know, to their buddies and their cronies and their spouses and their family members and their husbands and whatever, their dog. I don't know what will be next. But one of the saddest things I would say, and getting back a little bit to what my Liberal colleague said to me earlier, is that it absolutely is a direct result of this government, this collapsing faith within Alberta in the structures of the country. But when I go to Atlantic Canada, for example, they are deeply concerned by what's happening in Alberta because it impacts them. And I remember the United We Roll convoy that came to Ottawa. While the Liberals were suggesting that they were racists and bigots, what was actually happening was Ontario towns were coming out and giving pie and Tim Hortons and waving flags, and people were right across the country. And British Columbians want the pipeline, even though their governments pretend otherwise.
Resuming debate, reprise du débat, the honourable member for Fredericton.